The thermometer nailed to the porch post had frozen at a number no one in the valley wanted to read out loud. 42 degrees below zero. And yet smoke rose from the chimney of the small A-frame cabin at the tree line, slow and steady, the way smoke rises from a stove that is not fighting for its life. Inside, a man pressed his palm flat against the wall closest to the door. Not the stove side, the outer wall, the one that faced straight into the wind all night. It was warm, not hot. Warm enough that he left his hand there a moment longer than he needed to, just to be sure he wasn't imagining it. 3 months earlier, that same wall had been covered in frost on the inside, and his breath had hung in the air of his own kitchen. Something had changed since then, something the neighbors down the road had laughed at when they first saw it happening. Piece by piece, stone by stone, stacked around the base of a cabin shaped like a tent. Nobody rings an A-frame with fieldstone. There are no straight walls to speak of, nothing flat to lean rock against, nothing that looks like it should work. He had heard every version of that argument before he ever touched the first stone. And still, on the coldest night the valley had seen in years, his cabin held. This is the story of how a man with a cabin too thin for winter and a pile of field stones everyone else considered junk found something in the shape of his own land that the wind had never been able to explain. It did not come from a book. It came from watching, failing, and watching again. Caleb Odom had built the cabin himself in 11 days, working from first light until his hands would no longer close around the handle of an axe. It stood at the edge of a pine slope in the Wyoming territory, shaped like an upside-down letter, steep enough on both sides that snow would have nowhere to sit and no reason to stay. That much, at least, he had gotten right. Everyone who saw it agreed the roofline was smart. What worried Ezra Pruitt, the rancher whose land bordered his to the east, was everything below the roofline. An A-frame cabin has no true walls in the way most cabins do. The roof comes down at an angle and simply becomes the wall. Thin board meeting thin board, with nothing behind it but framing, and whatever a man could stuff between the boards before the cold arrived. Ezra stood at the edge of Caleb's clearing one afternoon in late September, hat in hand, watching smoke rise from a chimney that did not yet have a single cord of split wood stacked beside it. "You built it fast," Ezra said. "Fast is not the same as ready." Caleb did not argue. He had come west 2 years earlier with almost nothing. A discharge paper from the war folded in his coat pocket, and a promise to himself that he would not go back to a town that had already decided what kind of man he was. The cabin was supposed to be proof of something. He was not yet sure of what. Inside, at night, he could hear the wind finding every seam in the boards, a thin, searching sound, like something running its fingers along the wall looking for a way in. He told himself it was only September. He told himself the real cold was still weeks away, and that a man who had survived worse than a Wyoming winter could figure out how to keep a fire going. He did not yet know how wrong that comfort would turn out to be, because the cold that year was not going to wait for its usual month, and when it came early, it was going to find every mistake in that thin, fast-built cabin before Caleb had time to hide a single one of them. The first hard frost came on the 9th of October, nearly 3 weeks before anyone expected it. Caleb woke to a skin of ice on the water bucket beside his bed, and a wall that had gone cold enough to sting when his shoulder brushed against it in his sleep. He built up the fire before dawn, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge, the far side of the cabin, the side facing the open valley, was still cold enough to fog his breath. He walked the outside of the cabin that morning, running his palm along the boards the way a man checks a horse for injury, feeling for the places where the wind had already found its way through. There were more of them than he wanted to count. Thin gaps where the wood had shrunk. a corner near the door where the framing had never quite closed tight. None of it was visible from a distance. All of it was working against him at night, when the temperature dropped and the wind came down off the ridge with nothing to slow it. He split wood for 3 straight days, telling himself that enough fuel would solve what the walls could not. By the end of the 3rd day, his wood pile was taller than it had ever been, and the cabin was still losing its warmth within an hour of the fire dying down. That was the part that troubled him most. Not the cold itself, but how fast it returned once the fire went quiet. A cabin that could not hold heat for even a single hour after midnight was not a cabin that would survive a real Wyoming winter, no matter how much wood a man was willing to cut. Ezra rode past again near the end of that week and did not bother getting down from his horse. "You are going to need more than firewood," he said. "You are going to need something that does not care whether the fire is lit or not." Caleb did not understand what that meant. Not yet. But 2 days later, walking the fence line at the far edge of his property, he found something that would force him to. The pile had been there longer than Caleb had owned the land. A previous homesteader, long since moved on or given up, had cleared his fields of stone the way most men did in that country, dragging every rock too large for a plow blade to the edge of the property and leaving it there. Over the years, the pile had grown into a low, uneven wall of fieldstone, gray and rust-colored, half buried in grass that no one had bothered to cut. Caleb had walked past it a dozen times without giving it a second thought. It was the kind of thing a man stopped seeing after a while, the way he stopped seeing an old fence post or a dead tree. This time he stopped. He crouched down and picked up one of the flatter stones, turning it over in his hands. It was heavy in a way that felt different from the cold, quick chill of the wind. It held its own kind of weight, its own kind of stillness. He thought about the wall in his cabin that lost its warmth within the hour. He thought about Ezra's words about something that did not care whether the fire was lit or not. By the following morning, he had dragged the first cartload of stone up to the cabin and begun stacking it, loose and uneven, around the base of the wall that faced the open valley. Ezra found him there 2 days later, sweating in the cold, his hands scraped raw from lifting stone after stone into a rough half-circle around the cabin's lower edge. "You are putting a stone fence around a tent," Ezra said, not unkindly, but plainly. "There is nothing here for the rock to lean against. An A-frame does not have a wall like other cabins. It has an angle." Caleb straightened, wiping his hands on his coat. "Then I will build the rock to fit the angle," he said. Ezra did not answer that. He only shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he has decided arguing further is a waste of breath, and turned his horse back toward his own land. Caleb kept stacking. He did not yet know that his first attempt, however many days of aching shoulders it cost him, was going to fail before the first real snow ever touched the ground. By the 3rd week of October, Caleb had a rough ring of stone circling the lower 2 feet of his cabin's east and north sides, the directions the wind favored most. He had piled the stones the only way he knew how, close together, stacked as high as his arms could reach without falling, with no particular order beyond wanting more rock between himself and the wind. The first real test came on a night in early November, when the temperature dropped well below freezing and stayed there until morning. He woke twice in the night, each time to the same cold creeping along the floor near the north wall. He got up the second time and pressed his hand against the stone from the inside, hoping to feel some trace of the warmth he had been promising himself for weeks. There was nothing. The stone was cold, flat, ordinary cold, no different from the wind outside it. In the gray light before sunrise, he went out and studied the wall from a distance. The way he had once studied a wounded animal to understand where the injury actually was. rather than where he assumed it must be. What he saw troubled him. The stones on the shaded side of the cabin, the side that never caught direct sun, were dusted with frost that had not melted even hours after daylight. The stones on the western corner, where the morning light reached briefly before the ridge blocked it again, were already clear. He had built the ring without paying any attention to where the sun actually touched his land throughout the day. He had assumed that more stone, piled anywhere, would simply hold more cold at bay. That assumption, he now understood, had been wrong in a way that mattered. Nora, his late brother's widow, who had come west with him that spring and kept house in the small lean-to beside the cabin, watched him from the doorway as he stood there in the cold, staring at a wall of rock that was not doing what he needed it to do. "It looks the same as it did a week ago," she said. "Are you certain this was the right idea?" Caleb did not answer right away. He was still looking at the frost line, at the exact place where the shadow of the ridge ended and the weak November sun began. He was beginning to suspect that the stones themselves were not the mistake. The mistake was that he had never once asked where the sun went. For 4 days, Caleb stopped stacking stone and started watching. He walked the perimeter of his cabin at dawn, at midday, and again in the last hour before dark, marking with a stick where the shadow of the ridge fell and where it lifted. He noticed things he had never bothered to notice in 2 years of living on that slope. The northeast corner of the cabin sat in shadow nearly the entire day, from the moment the sun rose until it slipped behind the pines. The southwest corner, by contrast, caught a narrow band of direct light for almost 4 hours each afternoon, even in late autumn, even with the sun sitting low and pale on the horizon. It was Nora who noticed the second detail, the one that mattered even more than the sunlight. She had gone out one cold morning to fetch water and stopped near the woodpile, looking down at the ground rather than at the cabin itself. "The snow melts first along there," she said, pointing to a narrow strip of bare earth running along the southwest wall. It was gone from that strip nearly 2 full days before it cleared anywhere else on the property. Caleb crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the exposed ground. It was not warm, not by any ordinary measure, but it held less cold than the shaded ground 10 feet away. Something in that patch of earth, whether it was the angle of the slope, the type of soil, or the hours of thin autumn sunlight it managed to catch, was behaving differently from the rest of his land. He thought back to the frost line on his failed wall of stone, the exact place where cold stone gave way to clear, sun-touched stone. The stone itself had never been the problem. The problem was that he had built it as though every side of his cabin faced the same weather, the same sun, the same wind. He had ignored the one thing Ezra had been trying, in his own blunt way, to tell him. An A-frame does not have a wall. It has an angle. And an angle facing south behaves nothing like an angle facing north. Caleb spent the 5th day walking the ring of stone he had already built, this time with a different question in mind. Not how much rock, but where the rock needed to sit thick, and where it barely needed to sit at all. By evening, he had a rough plan sketched into the dirt with a stick, a plan that would mean tearing down nearly everything he had built over the last 3 weeks, and starting again, with far less time left before the deep cold arrived than he would have liked. Tearing down 3 weeks of work took less than a single afternoon. Rebuilding it correctly took considerably longer. Caleb concentrated the thickest ring of stone along the north and northeast walls, the sides that sat in permanent shadow and took the worst of the wind coming down off the ridge. There, he stacked the fieldstone nearly waist-high, packing smaller rocks and gravel into the gaps between the larger ones so that wind could not slip through the cracks the way it had before. Along the southwest wall, Where the sun reached for those few precious hours each afternoon, he built the ring lower and left a narrow gap of open air between the stone and the cabin boards themselves, roughly 4 inches wide, running the full length of that side. Nora asked him why he would leave a gap at all, when the entire point seemed to be keeping the cold out. Caleb did not have a confident answer. He only had an instinct, built from 4 days of watching where the sun lingered and where the frost refused to melt. He suspected that the stone needed room to hold its own air, warmed briefly each afternoon, rather than pressing directly against cold wood and losing whatever heat it managed to gather. It was, he admitted to her, mostly a guess. Ezra rode by twice during the rebuilding and said very little either time, though his silence carried its own kind of judgment. On the second visit, he dismounted long enough to look closely at the narrow gap of open air along the southwest wall. "That is going to let the wind straight through," he said. "You have built yourself a chimney with no fire in it." Caleb did not know if Ezra was right. He only knew that the shaded ground near the northeast corner had stayed frozen for 2 extra days after everywhere else had thawed, and that the ground near the sunlit southwest corner had cleared first. Something about that difference mattered, even if he could not yet explain it the way Ezra wanted him to. By the last week of November, the rebuilt ring stood finished, uneven in places, patched with smaller stones wherever a gap had opened during the stacking, held together more by patience than by any skill Caleb would have claimed for himself. He did not know if it would work. He only knew that the deep cold was no longer weeks away. It was days away, and closing fast. The first real test came without warning, on a night in early December when the sky cleared completely and the temperature fell further and faster than anything Caleb had experienced since coming west. By midnight, the air outside had dropped to somewhere near 10 degrees below zero, cold enough that the water bucket froze solid within a few hours, cold enough that even the horses in Ezra's barn, a half-mile off, could be heard shifting anxiously in their stalls. Caleb kept the fire fed through the evening, then let it burn down naturally after midnight, the way he had for weeks, wanting to know what the cabin would do on its own, once the flames stopped fighting for it. He woke before dawn and pressed his palm to the north wall first, the wall that had failed him worst in his earlier attempt. It was cool, noticeably cool, but not the raw, biting cold of the outside air. It held something back, some thin margin of warmth that had not been there in his first failed version. The southwest wall, near the narrow air gap Ezra had doubted, felt different again, slightly warmer still, though Caleb could not have explained with any certainty why. It was not the full test. The valley had not yet seen its worst cold of the season, and everyone who had lived there longer than a single winter knew that a clear, quiet night near zero was nothing compared to what a true blizzard could bring, when wind and cold arrived together instead of one after the other. Still, it was proof of something, proof enough that Nora, checking the water bucket that morning, remarked that the ice inside had formed a thinner skin than it had on any night since the frost first came in October. Ezra heard about the change from one of his own ranch hands before he heard it from Caleb directly, and he rode over that same afternoon, saying nothing about chimneys or wasted wind this time. He only stood at the north wall for a long moment, palm flat against the stone, his expression unreadable. "It is warmer than it has any right to be," he finally said. Caleb almost smiled, but he was still thinking about what Nora had said the week before, about a season that showed no sign of easing, and about how far this quiet, cold night still stood from the kind of storm that could truly decide whether any of this had been worth the trouble. The storm arrived on the second week of January, and it did not announce itself gently. It began as wind, hard and steady out of the northwest, the kind that had found every weakness in Caleb's original cabin walls back in October. By nightfall, snow had joined the wind, driving sideways across the slope in a way that erased the tree line entirely. Ezra had ridden over that morning to warn him a system was moving down from the higher country, faster and colder than anything the almanac had predicted for that stretch of winter. By full dark, the temperature outside had fallen to a number Caleb did not fully believe, until he checked the thermometer a second time. 42 degrees below zero. At that kind of cold, most cabins in the territory were losing heat faster than any stove could replace it, no matter how much wood a man was willing to burn. Ezra had ridden back to his own ranch before the worst of it hit, but not before telling Caleb plainly that this was the night that would prove or disprove everything he had built. Inside the A-frame, Caleb kept the fire burning steadily, though not desperately, the way he once would have, feeding it in careful measures rather than piling it high out of fear. Nora sat close to the stove, with a blanket around her shoulders, listening to the wind scream along the ridge outside, a sound unlike anything either of them had heard that winter. Near midnight, Caleb walked the inside perimeter of the cabin, checking each wall the way he had every cold night for weeks. The north wall, the one that had failed so completely back in November, held a steady, muted warmth. Nothing dramatic, but nothing like the raw cold radiating through the doorframe nearby. The southwest wall, near the narrow gap of air Ezra had once called a chimney with no fire in it, felt warmer still, almost gentle by comparison to the fury outside. Somewhere close to 2 in the morning, the wind shifted briefly, gusting hard against the northeast corner in a way it had not done in previous storms. Nora noticed it first. A thin, searching draft along the floor near the door, the same kind of cold that had once kept Caleb awake in October. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Caleb only pressed his hand to the nearest section of stone, waiting to see whether the rest of the wall would hold against this one new angle of wind, or whether the storm had finally found the last mistake he had not yet corrected. The draft along the northeast corner did not grow worse. It held steady, thin and searching, but it did not deepen into the kind of cold that had once forced Caleb outside in the dead of night, with nothing but a lantern and a bad feeling. He knelt by the corner and traced the gap with his fingers until he found it, a narrow seam where the stone met the stacked pile a little too loosely, a place he had packed in haste during the rebuilding weeks earlier. He worked a handful of loose gravel and packed snow into the gap by feel, the same way he had learned to patch every other weakness that autumn, and the draft eased within minutes. Nora did not go back to sleep. She sat close to the stove until the gray light of morning finally came through the single small window, watching Caleb doze upright in a chair, still dressed, still within reach of the wall. When the storm broke near dawn, the wind dropping as suddenly as it had risen, the valley outside looked like something reshaped overnight, drifts piled waist-high against fence posts, the tree line barely visible through a haze of blown snow. Ezra rode over as soon as the trail was passable, expecting, by his own later account, to find a cabin half buried and a fire long since dead. Instead, he found smoke still rising steadily from the chimney, and Caleb standing outside in his shirt sleeves, checking the stone ring for damage the storm might have caused. Ezra dismounted slowly and walked to the north wall without a word. He pressed his bare hand flat against the stone and left it there for a long moment, longer than he needed to confirm anything. Long enough that Caleb wondered if he was simply reluctant to say what he was feeling. It should not have made it through a night like that, Ezra finally said. Not a cabin shaped like a tent, not with stone stacked around it that has no proper wall to lean against. Caleb did not have a clever answer for him. He only said what he had come to understand over the previous months, that the stone had never been keeping the cold out on its own. It had been holding on to whatever thin warmth the sun and the stove gave it during the day, and releasing that warmth slowly, long after both had gone quiet, buying the cabin hours it would never have had otherwise. Ezra looked at the wall a moment longer, then out at the ruined, drifted valley beyond it. "Whatever you did," he said, "do it to the barn next." Word of the cabin traveled through the valley the way most things did that winter. Slowly at first, carried by a rancher here, a passing trader there, until by the following autumn, 3 other families along the ridge had begun stacking fieldstone of their own, watching the sun the way Caleb had, marking where the frost lingered and where it lifted first. None of them built it exactly the way he had. One family left a wider gap of air along their southern wall. Another packed their stone thicker on a western exposure that caught wind off the river rather than the ridge. The idea traveled, but the details bent to fit each piece of land it landed on, the same way Caleb's own version had bent to fit his. Ezra never stacked stone around his own barn that year or the year after. He always claimed he was too set in his ways for it, though those who knew him best suspected it had less to do with stubbornness and more to do with a quiet respect for something he had once doubted, and did not feel it was his place to claim as his own. Caleb stayed in the valley for the rest of his life, by most local accounts, and the cabin stood long after the reasons for building it had been forgotten by anyone outside that stretch of Wyoming. Later generations who lived there, when asked why the old A-frame near the tree line had stone stacked so carefully around its base, would sometimes shrug and say it had always been that way, without knowing the 11 days it took to build, or the 3 weeks it took to tear down and rebuild, or the one clear, brutal night in January when a man stood with his hand against a wall, waiting to find out if patience had been enough. The cabin had never been about the stone itself. It had been about giving a Wyoming winter fewer places left to enter. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.